evening. We will begin because it has become indeed that beginning time, and our time goes by so very quickly. I would like to welcome again our very, very dear colleague, Dr. Marilyn Friend, and she will present her presentation, Difficult Interactions, in the spirit of Elizabeth Farrell, and she will introduce herself. So welcome again, and thank you on behalf of Illinois Council for Exceptional Children and our anniversary series in honor of the 100th year of the Council for Exceptional Children. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for being with us.
Glad to be here. Welcome, everybody. Just one word about Zoom norms, which we all know. First, we're not too large a group, and so I'm really hoping that if people have questions, you can either turn your mic on and just say, Marilyn, I'd like to ask a question. I've had to try to encourage people because it's not rude to interrupt on Zoom because I can only see some people. I can't see everybody, so raising your hand doesn't do any good. Questions are also fine, and it shouldn't happen, but just in case, the power glitches or the internet does something, I have a hotspot, I'll be right back. I always like to warn people about that. It has happened several times as we've gone through the pandemic. I was in a school district not too long ago remotely, and a quarter of the school district lost the internet. That made our group rather small all of a sudden. Just a few words about me. Like what qualifies me and like who am I? Quick background, I am by background a general ed teacher, a special ed teacher, higher ed for most of my career, several textbooks, past president of CEC. I have always been interested in the topic of collaboration, and what I have always tried to do is figure out how to help the adults in schools act like grown-ups, which all of us have to admit is not always easy, but that's sort of who I am and how I come to you. Paula was asking, she said, people want to know more about you. They want to know about your story. First, you should know I'm from Northwest Indiana, and going to town meant going to Chicago. And we used to take the South Shore when we were kids. I don't know if I'd allow a kid to do that now, but that's how we would get around. We go to downtown Chicago and hang out and do all kinds of fun things. I'm also going to spend Thanksgiving, just so you know, my Illinois connection, going to spend Thanksgiving dinner at my brother and sister-in-law's in Naperville. So I have Northern Illinois there. And probably a few of you who know me know that I was at Northern Illinois University for about 6 years. So I've got some pretty good ties to Illinois and have always enjoyed when I've been able to come back and work, because I've worked in a lot of school districts in the area. And actually right now I have 3 different big projects going on in the state of Illinois. The other thing Paula said was people want to know more about you. So here's something very few people know about me. People accuse me of working too much, but just so you know, I do other things as well. There's nothing like showing a picture of oneself scuba diving, because you do not need to worry about what your hair looks like, So there I am scuba diving. There's a story for you. Now, I just want to double check. I know we've got university, we've got teachers, we've got special ed leadership personnel. Is there anybody here that I should know who you are or know kind of what your role is? If so, just type it quickly in the chat box. Otherwise, I'll kind of presume we're talking about educators and people involved in the education of kids with disabilities, directly or indirectly, maybe a couple students who are on. And I'll hope that kind of covers us. And Paula, if you'll kind of keep an eye on the chat box, I'd appreciate it. And if there's something that comes up that I really need to know about, I'd like to know, please. All right, now, I hope that we have all reached this point in where we are in this school year. Burnout was our greatest challenge until we changed our mission statement to chill. I'm sure that every person who's on this session, it knows about some horrifically stressful event going on at school, or I know places where they've already declared the entire week of Thanksgiving will be a break because people are so burned out already, and people are just working their hearts out in a very tough situation. So I want to start by acknowledging that and really being grateful for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here and being able to share for just a little while, but I'm even more delighted that people are taking the time to come and join, because I know it's a really tough school year. I would be happiest if this session was not just me talking. And, I'm hoping we'll get a few more people as we go along, but I also have no need to do all of my slides. And if we need to stop and talk about something, if there are examples you'd like to talk about difficult interactions, cool with me. Just do that, interrupt, ask a question, type them in the chat box. And that way it'll be a session for you and not just a session where somebody talks at you on Zoom for an hour. Now, before I actually start, what I'd really like to do is set just a little bit of a context. And this topic with Elizabeth Farrell as our background kind of has some threads that pull at my life and really bring me into this picture. And I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to share 3 of those with you. They're specific, and they are part of my life story. The first one is this. Now, you know that Elizabeth Farrell did her work in the very beginning of the 20th century, and she was a very influential woman. And this is the time when immigration was so very, very important. And if you think about what Elizabeth Farrell did as the founder of ungraded classes in the New York City schools, really, when you think about it, many of the children in those classes probably were children of immigrants or recent immigrants themselves. And part of this was about not being acculturated, about not speaking the language, about not having the parental supports. And so the ungraded classes undoubtedly had a very high number of immigrants. Well, I am just second generation in this country. The passport that you see there is my grandfather's passport. And he came, the one side you can see is his photo. The other side, I don't know if you can even read it. It's when he was approved by the American consulate in Zagreb to come to the United States through Le Havre. So he went to Paris and then exited from Le Havre and came through Ellis Island. And so I often think, my grandmother also was an immigrant. Her family came earlier. She was only 3 or 4 years old. And so I often think that she could have been caught in this notion that if you're not just like everybody else, you must be defective, which was sort of the thinking of the time. So that's one of my first threads, is that it strikes very near and dear to my heart when we talk about people who were coming to this country, because my family was Eastern European and they were not considered preferred individuals when they came. I should add the postscript that fortunately, I don't know why or how, but there were enough resources that they did not stay in New York City. My family immediately went to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and settled there, where they could work in the iron ore mines for the steel industry. That's one thread. Second thread, just for a little different sort of thing. This is a picture from a settlement house, and Elizabeth Farrell worked with the Henry Street Settlement House in New York City. And I don't know where you are on the history of special ed, but I love the history of special ed. And so just a moment or two on it. Settlement houses began very early, late 19th century, early 20th century. And what they were was an excuse for middle-class women to have a place to go to be constructive. They weren't allowed to work. There was no such thing as work for like upstanding ladies. And so settlement houses gave them a place to go, and they would teach skills to immigrant women. And the girls you see in a picture like this, you can see it looks like they're weaving. They taught sewing and other kinds of, polite crafts that you're supposed to know if you're in the beginning of the 20th century. And Elizabeth Farrell was part of that, and she was associated with that settlement house. Now, fast forward a generation. Settlement houses were not just in New York City, they expanded. And in the Chicago area, they also had settlement houses. My mom she grew up in a background that poor does not even describe it. She was on her own completely by the time she was about 15 years old. And she went through high school earning room and board babysitting for someone. And room was a sofa in the living room. And it was a drawer and a dresser. That was all she had. And she'll comment, she says she doesn't even know how she managed because she had nothing and she had no family. And so the family that she babysat for fed her as well. And she'll say, I don't know how I got what I needed for school. Somebody evidently gave it to me at some point. Now, knowing that about her, you should also know this. I can't resist. My mom was valedictorian of her class, a rather large class for that day and age. And as soon as she graduated, a priest who was associated with the settlement house near where she lived employed her to work in the settlement house because he was very concerned that otherwise her life would not lead a good path, that she would not have a good road ahead. And so she's always been very associated with and has a great fondness for the whole idea of a settlement house. That's the second thread. And I had to tell you that just because settlement house plays into this. The third thread, I have to mention collaboration, because if you know me, you know that collaboration has always been my first love. And I have to tell you, when I was starting my own doctoral studies, I wanted to study how the adults in schools work together to educate children with disabilities. And my wonderful mentors at Indiana University kind of looked at me and said, you want to do what? And if you have not been around as long as I have, you won't know the fact that the word collaboration wasn't used. Consultation was as close as we got. And it was mostly the consultant teacher model out of the University of Vermont. And there was no coursework, and there was nobody who specialized in the area. So I ended up getting a minor in community psychology. So I went over to the psychology department. They didn't really want me, but they had to take me because I was very much an outlier. But it was where I could get information and increase my knowledge of people working together on behalf of others. And so, by the way, if anybody is in a doctoral program, among those of you who are here this evening, choose a topic that nobody knows anything about, because you get finished much more quickly because nobody even knows what to ask you about your topic. I developed a number of initial collaboration courses and at different universities, and Elizabeth Farrell and her work really stressed collaboration. I came across an article in the New York Times archives from, I don't know, 1930 or something, where it was Elizabeth Farrell describing her work in growing ungraded classes and how she had reached out to various civic agencies who were helping her and encouraging parents to enroll their children. So that I am very impressed that she did that and feel that tie with her. So those are a few little things, but now let's switch and talk a little bit about interactions. And it's so interesting because from the very inception of what eventually became special education, I suspect difficult interactions or challenging interactions have kind of been definitional for our field. And if you think about Elizabeth Farrell and her history and what she was doing, she really was a leader in being able to address difficult interactions. For example, can you imagine how audacious it was that as a relatively young teacher, she had taught in upstate New York, then she came to New York City, and she basically said, I'll take those kids who aren't being successful. I'm going to take across several grade levels, these children, and I will teach them, and we will call it ungraded classes. Realize this is in an era where if you didn't fit in, you were sent home. There's not mandatory attendance until after she began. At some point, mandatory attendance was undertaken for kids, I think, to about 12 or 13. But she wanted the kids. She wanted to try to reach them. And her goal was to help them improve enough that they could be back with their peers in classrooms. As mandatory attendance laws were passed, it put more and more of a burden on her because there were more and more children then who were in classes who were not making it. And she's like, give them to me. I can do it. Can you imagine the conversations that went on about that? Now, I will tell you, she had one advantage. She had a superintendent at that time in New York City schools who supported her work. And I suspect she was able to do some of it because of that support. Here's a second thing that I just love. All right, does everybody know who Henry Goddard is? And I know the other sessions have focused more on like the details of Elizabeth Farrell's life. But you got to realize this Henry Goddard guy, he was an eminent psychologist. He was the one pushing for IQ testing, and he did an evaluation of the ungraded classes. And his conclusion, everyone thought Elizabeth Farrell would jump all over and be delighted. He said the problem is there are not nearly enough of these classes, and that what we need are lots more of them throughout the New York City schools to prepare children for when they will be in institutions. You know what Elizabeth Farrell did? She shocked everybody. She said, oh, no, 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 no. And she publicly and vehemently disagreed with his report, saying that is not the purpose of these programs. The purpose of an ungraded class is for the child to return to classmates in a regular class and lead a typical life after school. Now, you talk about difficult conversations. I think that one was probably pretty interesting as well. And man, she just went right in his face. I love it. That wasn't done at that day and age. The last thing that she was very involved in was convincing parents and getting them to agree to allow their children to participate in an ungraded class. You know, if you think about how difficult it is convincing parents sometimes of certain things, imagine kind of, you know, the word on the street was these are classes for the language of the day, backward children, the defective children. And can you imagine the difficult interaction she had talking to the parents saying this would benefit your child? I cannot imagine. So Elizabeth Farrell had her own set of challenges. Today, ours are different. I put in a few examples just to kind of spur your thinking as we go along, but these are certainly not the only ones. What about co-teaching? Now, there's all kinds of things that can happen with co-teaching, but what about a co-teacher who doesn't want a teaching partner? That can work in either direction. Now, there are lots of other co-teaching examples. Co-teachers where the model is, I teach today, you teach tomorrow, or you do the warm-up, I'll do the real lesson, then you can help kids when I'm finished. Ooh, that sounds negative. Miscommunication about changes in lesson plans, whether or not we're going to do what we said we were going to do, on and on and on. So one set of examples comes from co-teaching. How about parents? Challenging interactions. The parent wants 3 times the phone. This is a real example. Parent wanted at least 3 phone calls a week to discuss the child's progress that week in school. And of course, the poor special ed teacher was basically say, I can't do it. I don't have the time. The parent wants me on the phone for an hour. I can't spend 3 hours a week talking with one parent about one child. There are other parent challenging conversations. What about explaining to a parent that perhaps the setting that the child is in is not the right one? What about a parent who believes that a teacher is picking on the child or is being unfair to the child? We have lots and lots and lots of those. How about interactions with advocates? I was live in a place just last week where many things are driven by advocates. They have IEPs that will have 15, 18, 22 goals on them because the advocate wants 22 goals on the IEP. You know, advocates sometimes will ask for things that the team would consider not justified. Speech language services 5 days a week for a child with mild learning disability, occupational therapy 3 or 4 times a week, whatever it happens to be, or the number of minutes. I don't want that child in a co-taught class. I want all of the services to be in a separate setting because I think that's better for the child. So lots of advocate issues that we deal with. How about, I had to throw in administrators. How about principals who create classes based on ability levels? And we end up with kids in homogeneous class groups. If you haven't ever seen this, don't laugh. I've seen it done as young as primary grades, where kids are literally sentenced based on early performance, and it will drive the rest of their school careers. That could be a difficult interaction or two. And then I put in one for paraprofessionals, a paraprofessional who decides to march to his or her own drummer, and who may say, well, I decided that was too hard for the child, so we're not going to do it. And really is almost defiant in terms of disagreeing with the teacher who is supposed to be supervising. So I don't know how my list is. I don't know if that's a good list to work from, or a list that you would find typical, or if you would add a lot of other items to it. But I thought that would at least get your brains around what it is we're talking about. And it's really tempting when these things happen to kind of say, what I'd really like to do is just go hide my head in the sand. And I'm sure we've all done that occasionally, trying to hide from the difficult interactions. But of course, it's not very helpful. So I now have a new motto for all of us. When those difficult interactions are going to happen, how about this instead? What would Elizabeth Farrell do? And what would Elizabeth Farrell do to address those difficult interactions and make them be better than they otherwise might have been? In thinking about this and in trying to put this session together, one thing I'll tell you that crossed my mind is that I think Elizabeth Farrell would love and would immediately go to first the CEC Code of Ethics. And the Code of Ethics is a total of 12 statements. And, it's evening and you don't need a text heavy set of slides. And so I just took, the numbers are deliberately not in order. It's number 4, number 5, and number 8 from the CEC Code of Ethics. And if you look at them, I think they very much address difficult interactions, practicing collegiality with everybody who's providing services to kids, relationships with family, and involving them meaningfully in the education of their children. And the last one, I think it leads to some of our difficult interactions, this whole concept of neither engaging in nor tolerating practices that could harm individuals with exceptionalities. I really hope any of you who haven't looked at the Code of Ethics, that you will take a quick screenshot or else scan that QR code, because I did a link to it for you so that you could take a look at the Code of Ethics. It guides us and it tells us where we want to be as professionals when we are in those challenging interactions. And if that's always at the back of your mind, you almost can't go wrong. So let me leave that. I hope you had enough time to get a quick snapshot of that. And then I thought what I would do tonight, instead of being too technical, I thought I would kind of do some kind of general advice and thoughts for you on how to deal with those kinds of situations that I just outlined within the context of the Code of Ethics. But again, please interject questions, and I'm happy to talk about situations, whatever you'd like. So here we go. First one. And this, I think we have to remember a lot, is that we have to understand what we can and cannot change. Sometimes I find people get very, very frustrated. They really want something to be different, and it's outside their sphere of influence. I like to think of special educators as being really masterful influencers. I love that term because there's a lot of things we don't control, and there are a lot of things that we can't force, and there are a lot of things we can't compel. Ask any special ed director, they can compel compliance, and that's about it. When we have school districts where administrators have a lot of control over their schools and they don't have to go along with the bigger picture, sometimes there are things that aren't going to change and we don't control them. Sometimes we wish parents would deal with their children differently. We don't control it. And at some point we have to say, how much of our time and how much of our energy do we spend on items that we have no control over, that we may try to influence, but at some point we say we've done our influence and now we have to focus on what we do have some control over and where we can have a positive impact. I start with that because I listen to a lot of frustrated professionals and they want things to be different. They want parents to be different. They want kids to be different. They want administrators to be different. They want their teaching partners to be different. It's like, let's step back first and look big, big, big picture at what's possible and what maybe just is not. That's number one. Here's another one. I always want to remind people, it's not what you say, it's how it's heard. Because many times we'll say, well, but I told him, or I told her, or I explained. It's like, doesn't matter. All that matters is whether it was received. And many times in our field, we miss because our messages are not heard by the other person. And it doesn't matter how well you think you did in a message. If the other person wasn't ready for it, if they have a different take on the situation, it may end up really compounding the difficulty of an interaction. I often mention, and some of you I know my work pretty well, that we always have to keep in mind perspective or point of view. It's the frame of reference that people have. We all have a way we look at the world. We have lenses based on our background, our experiences, who we interact with, our families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It affects everything we do, including how we give and how we receive messages from other people. And I always wanted, when I was teaching collaboration coursework, I would always tell people, when you're interacting, especially when it's difficult, you should be running two things at one time. You are talking, but then there should be a little you on your shoulder, monitoring the quality of what you're doing and adjusting it based on observing the other people or the other person with whom you're interacting, because it doesn't matter unless your message is received. Just a little bit, that's pretty specific and that's a little bit technical, but I think it's a real part of difficult interactions. I've always recommended to people that when somebody makes a comment or asks a question and maybe it sounds snide or the comment has a little edge to it, I've always encouraged people to say things like, I guess I need to understand that a little better. Or I'm wondering what's behind what you're saying. And a very gentle, encouraging, more words, because it could be that the person just had to put their great aunt in hospice and the tone has nothing to do with you, it has to do with life. And that if we can take the time to encourage people to talk a little bit more, we might be able to better understand. That seems like 1,000% more important, especially since COVID, because there are stressors that we don't know about and we have to understand people and have the patience and grace to go with them from wherever they are, and we can't impose where we are. How about this? Sometimes, it's a whole different take. Sometimes when we have difficult interactions, a really good thing to do is to leverage a message by invoking the outside other. In other words, I was at a session last evening and that Dr. Friend, I know she's in, if you look her up on Google, she comes up, she recommended that, and you blame someone else for the message that you need to share. Let's see, the school district sent me to a workshop on co-teaching, and they were adamant at that workshop that we both teach during instruction. See, it's leverage. It's a way to open a message that otherwise might not be well received by deliberately not owning the message. Let someone else own the message and you just be the bearer of the message. You'd be surprised how effective that can be sometimes. And this is not me just like making things up sitting at my desk. This is from the psychology research on how to handle interactions and how to try to move a little bit when it's something that's a difficult situation. So I throw that one in as yet another. How about this? One of the most important things that people who are really good at dealing with difficult interactions learn is that silence is powerful. By the way, I have to tell you, I had the great good fortune to go on a safari on the Serengeti, And that I took that picture like on my phone, and it was like, oh my word, this place is so vast and so silent. There's nothing. There's nothing. And in a difficult interaction, many people become a little nervous, a little defensive, a little anxious, and the rush is to fill any void with words. When in fact, sometimes the best thing to do is to back off, even to say, I need to think about that for just a moment, and then calm. Or if you ask a question and someone doesn't respond immediately, instead of saying, well, you know, what I meant was, say, it's fine. I know you probably need a minute to think. And really learn that not talking is sometimes more powerful than talking. An interested expression, the slight leaning forward, the comfort with silence can really be a tool. And the harder the interaction, the more important it is to have a little bit of a measure, a little bit of a tempo that's slightly slowed in terms of the interaction. Silence is one way to do that. Like I said, I'm just doing kind of light touches this evening. Now, the big one, of course, are the communication skills. And in any difficult interaction, the better your communication skills, the better the outcome will be. So that instead of saying, well, did you try what I suggested? Ooh, that's not a question to ask in a difficult interaction. Instead, the question is, well, when you tried the intervention, what happened? Notice there's all kinds of assumptions in there, that the person did it, that the person was paying attention, that there might have been good things, that there might have been bad things. Or how about this? Instead of, is there something you'd like me to suggest, or is there an intervention you'd be happy with? What about instead saying, when you tried interventions, which ones came the closest to being effective? What that does is it kind of eliminates the nothing works response. And I'm just doing, a simple example for you. That's knowing how to ask questions in a way that propels a conversation forward in a constructive manner. Same thing, I'm going to mention it because everybody knows about it. Paraphrasing, oh, gag. A lot of times people say they paraphrase, and their method of paraphrasing starts with, I hear you saying that. I used to threaten students that I'd give them an F in the class if they ever said that to anybody and called it paraphrasing, because it's such a pseudo-psychological trigger. It's just very ineffective. Instead, when someone's done a paragraph on a kid talking about concerns, or a family's been talking with you about something that's really a problem, just saying back to them, Jonathan is experiencing a lot of disruptions at home. He's complaining about what's happening at school, and you're hoping that we can have a conversation about what to do next. Notice the word I was not in there anywhere. If we're really doing effective paraphrasing, it shouldn't be about us. It should be about the other person. It's also just a quick summary that's completely factual. That's paraphrasing, just in a little nutshell. And that's the way we want our interactions to go. I'll tell you another little secret. When interactions are difficult, paraphrasing can also give you think time. So that if you can really be in the moment and listen to what a person says, and then repeat back the highlight, your brain can be processing that, and it can help you decide where to go next. So it's a good, I mentioned tempo, and that we want the tempo to be a little bit slower sometimes in difficult interactions. Paraphrasing can help on the tempo as well. All right, let me keep going here because I'm supposed to allow plenty of time for questions was the message. I just have a few more things I really wanted to kind of point out. I really wish anybody who has to do difficult interactions would practice when it's easy. Practice when you take your car into the shop and you need to ask a few questions about when you're getting it back and probably how much it's going to cost. It's a good time to practice good question asking skills. When you're in a retail establishment and you're talking to somebody behind a counter, that's a good time to try indirect questions, where you make a statement that stands as a question. I'm wondering what the best item is on the menu. See, that's an indirect question. I'm going to rehearse it so that when I need an indirect question for a tough interaction, I'm wondering what direction we should go at this point with Jonathan. I have it because I practiced it related to the menu, and then I have it when we're talking about Jonathan. Even with people that you work with, and I will also tell you that if there is a really difficult interaction coming up, perhaps a team meeting or a parent meeting that somebody's really concerned about, I also encourage people to rehearse. Get a couple colleagues. I know nobody has any extra time these days, but sometimes things will go better if you say, how about you play the parent? You know the parent well, and just kind of think like the parent and help me practice how to respond when the parent says things that the parent's probably going to say. That also gives you a sense of confidence in a difficult interaction. It can be very, very constructive and help you handle it better than just being worried about whether or not it's going to fall apart. Now, I put resistance in here because a lot of things that we deal with in special education are not as much direct conflict. There are some things that are, but a lot of things are actually because of resistance. And probably my favorite thing in the world in terms of a definition in collaboration is the definition of resistance. Ready? Resistance is the ability to not get what you don't want from your environment. It does not work to take the double negative out. The double negative is very, very deliberate. And what we find is resistance only happens when somebody is pushing something at you that you perceive as a threat, and then you push back. Conflict is usually more overt. We're going at each other. We have different points of view and we're doing this. I don't wake up in the morning planning to resist. I only resist if you push something at me that I perceive is not in my best interest. Professionals in schools don't come to school planning to resist. Teenagers might, but usually not adults. And it means that resistance usually is about an implied change, something that is making the person feel unsafe. And the trick to it is addressing that. And many of our difficult interactions are about this. It comes from lots of things. And again, I don't need to do all of this. It's about the proposed change itself. Oh my word, I'm working with like 3 different places right now where they have not had much in the way of any inclusive practices. Almost all services are pulled out, like surprisingly so. And we're talking about people who just don't like the idea of quote unquote, those kids. Could you imagine Elizabeth Farrell? Those kids being in the classroom, much less a teacher too, co-teaching. Sometimes it's about the impact. Probably everybody's had it happen where some general ed teachers are resistant to co-teaching because they're worried that they won't look good as teachers. I one time had a really superb general ed teacher say, quote, "I hate co-teaching. I'm a very good teacher, but it's by myself. And when I'm trying to work with someone else, it makes me not be as effective as I was." Whoa, talk about a heavy conversation. It's also about worrying about what other people will think. Will you lose status because you went along with something? And sometimes resistance is just that people would rather keep things the same, even if they're awful, because they know what they have. And the prospect of things being different is terrifying to some people. I always encourage people, if you think resistance is going on, treat the person you're interacting with as though they are scared. It's a fear reaction, because that tends to make us more patient. Treat that person as fragile. When we sense resistance, many of us tend to get a little bit like, why can't that person see what needs to be done? And we tend to want to push. And yet, if we know somebody's fragile, we know not to push. And a lot of times with resistance, it's about fragile. It's about feeling insecure. It's about worrying about whether or not this will have a negative impact. So resistance The people who are most likely to welcome change are wet babies. And in schools, that's not what we're dealing with. And so a lot of times we have trouble when we're trying to get people to change. And we end up with persuasion. And persuasion becomes one of our key tools. I suspect Elizabeth Farrell was a master of persuasion because she managed to get the ungraded classes started. And then she ended up in charge of all of them for the whole Department of Ed in New York City. She was able to persuade agencies to work with her in order to create more classes and get children enrolled, persuade parents that their children belonged in the classes, and persuade the superintendent that Goddard's report was not the way the district should go. So I suspect she was pretty good at it. There are a lot of ways to persuade, and I threw this in here just because I hated not to put a little bit of content in it. We can give rewards and consequences. We can say, it's you were really good with, I don't know, Josie last year, and Jonathan is so much like her. And you just create that little discrepancy, cognitive dissonance, saying, wow, you don't close it. You don't say, therefore, you should be good with Jonathan because you were good with Josie. Just leave it open and let people worry about it. Relating it to people and people's current knowledge. This is very similar to what you did before with. That's a way to convince people. And then the whole notion about you are a senior person, you know a lot, everybody trusts you. I'm hoping I can trust you as well to give this a try. In other words, responding to what we know appeals to adult learners, novelty, respect for their history and their stature. When we are trying and we have difficult interactions going on, we have tools. And those are all very specific tools that do not originate in education. They originate in business, where there's a much more robust literature on how we interact, how people interact, but very, very, very applicable to our work in schools. Now, I always have to throw in a couple of cartoons, and I love Michael G. and Greco cartoons. Knowing how hard it is to affect meaningful change in people, Mr. Moody decides to work his way up to it by teaching old logs new tricks. Okay, I know it's evening. Maybe that's not funny, but I find it hilarious. We have to work up to it. We have to continue to hone our skills when we do have difficult interactions and really try remembering our sphere of influence to move things a step at a time. I've been saying, I'll do a quick co-teaching example. I've been saying to co-teachers for the past year. Last year, I pretty much said, if you're in school and you're working with kids and you're making it work, I'm with you, because people were so stressed. But this year, it's like, how about try it the way it's supposed to be, at least once a week? I understand that this is hard, and I understand the two of you need to work it out, but we can't waste another year on kids not getting the education they're entitled to. So don't try to change everything at once. What if you tried one thing? And my go-to is 2 stations, not 3. Get rid of the independent group. General ed teacher teach content as typical. Special educator using assessment data, do the backfill. Many kids are missing many skills. Switch halfway through because kids can't move, the teachers have to move. Now we're starting to get an iteration of something closer to what is station teaching in the middle of the pandemic, where things are not ideal, keeping the general ed teacher comfortable providing the content, special educator delivering remedial skill gap work, and move it along gradually. That's the way we grow this, and it prevents what can be difficult interactions from becoming impossible interactions. Now, I think I have just 1 or 2 more points. Oh, what happened? I went backwards. There we go. In all of this, remember, I've walked through a few things to keep in mind, and then I did a little bit about resistance. The more stressful the interaction, the more important it is to be precise and to be very intentional, to know where you're going to go, what you need to accomplish, I am actually quite comfortable usually saying to people, if it's like going south, I wish people would be more comfortable saying, I just think maybe we'd be better off to have this conversation later. Even though it's tough, let's schedule a Zoom meeting in a couple days and continue the conversation then. Because if we don't know where we're going, or if we know where we're going and it's taken a left turn, then we want to see if we can back off a little bit so that we can have the outcome that we want. Over all of this, it's always about kids. And there's always that superordinate goal of, is this what is right for the student about whom we're talking, or the student who is affected by this? And we always have to put that front and center and judge what we're doing in terms of our interactions on whether or not it's what is right for kids. Now, see, I managed. Paula, you didn't think I could do it. Steph probably too, because you've seen me in class. It's very hard for me to stop talking. But we wanted to be sure we had enough time for questions and comments from anybody who's participating. And I think maybe we can stop the share now and see what people have to say and what they'd like to talk about. Anybody? Situations you have, concerns or questions you have about difficult interactions? Your Elizabeth Farrell questions? Ooh, it's a quiet group.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Doctor, it's a wonderful presentation. From your reading and studying Elizabeth Farrell, what started her to be involved with children that at that time she took on such a great task? Was there something personal that was going on in her life?
I don't think so. She was from upstate New York, from a rather well-to-do family, trained to be a teacher and taught in upstate New York for a couple of years, then came down to New York City. And my understanding is that she was just noticing that there were children who were kind of rejected by the other teachers. And she was volunteering to have a class with those children. And of course it was like, yeah, take those kids. For how many decades have we heard the expression, those kids? I think that when she was willing to do that, you have to realize it was not completely altruistic. There's something else that was going on at this time. She would say, yeah, I'm willing to take them. And then she started recruiting other teachers who would say, I'll make a group like that too. And eventually she agitated for teachers to get training in order to work with children who were difficult to work with. So it grew rather organically, but if you are not a student of this period in history, you have to realize the other thing that was going on, and the reason this was well received, is because it was believed that this would protect, quote unquote, normal children from the defectives. Ooh, makes my skin crawl to even say it. And so there is, in fact, I'll admit this, a million years ago when I was a doctoral student, and they would still do this, I requested some of the dissertations from the early 1930s from Teachers College at Columbia, where they discussed these ungraded classes, and they were researching them. And the dissertations pretty much set out to prove that these ungraded classes were good because they protected other children from these defective children. And so partly this grew because it was doing a service and it made everybody happy to get that group of children away from other kids.
Okay, thank you. One more question. What are your future plans? Writing another book, or what would you like? Time.
I am still too busy working in schools, and so I'm still doing lots and lots and lots of that. And I will tell you, I don't know, I was looking for silver linings throughout the pandemic because heaven knows we didn't have very many of them. But one of the most important silver linings for me was that with Dr. Tammy Barron, we were able to get a book done on specially designed instruction in co-teaching. And that idea had been laying around for like 5 years, and everybody knows how it is. Like, when you get around to writing, it's like you're so tired at the end of the day. And so that book got done. And I don't know if I'll do another one after that or not, because the big textbooks all have to be revised and they're all on a cycle. So I've got those, and I've got the co-teaching book and the SDI book. It's a lot of books. But I write some and stay out in schools all the time. And my family keeps saying, when are you going to retire? And I keep saying, I don't know. What's retire?
Yeah.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Someone else questions? What do you want to talk about?
Dr. Friend, I have a question.
Yes, Cody.
So regarding, I'm going to say current practices, because I hate the term best practices, because I feel like it limits differentiation. But when you talk about current practices in special education and keeping up with the theme of Elizabeth Farrell, how do you think special education today compares to what Elizabeth really hoped for what it would look like today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that in some ways she would be pleased with the emphasis on inclusive practices, because her goal was always that children would go back and be with their peers and that they would never go to an institution. That was radical for her day and age. And so I think that part of it, that she would probably really enjoy and treasure and be supportive. I suspect she would probably do some rather major editing of all the paperwork and procedures that we have now, because, you know, in her day and age, things were much simpler. And as everybody knows, people get very bogged down sometimes, even though it's not supposed to be the important part of special ed. It's what people get caught with, and all of the compliance work and all of the many, many, many different factors that cause special educators a lot of grief because they spend so much time on compliance. So I suspect she would not be all that thrilled with that part of special ed. I think that she would be respectful of the fact that assessments now must be multidimensional, because in her day and age, Goddard wanted to just give IQ tests to everybody and make lifelong decisions about students and their status in life just based on a single IQ score. And I think that the multidisciplinary way, the multidimensional assessments that we do, she would be a fan of. In terms of services, you know, I think she might be impressed, because of course everything is quite a bit more structured and nobody would have classes across many grade levels in this day and age. I think she would overall be pleased and would see that there has been progress. I suspect she would also say there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time this evening.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it. Others?
Well, I'm going to pop in because I haven't, gotten to have conversation.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the students that I have in my classroom right now as college sophomores, juniors. We're looking at children, not babies, they're young adults who were born in 2000, 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
There are a lot of generational communication differences. And I'm struggling with, how do we help students learn to navigate the communication when they're still learning how to communicate themselves? Because they are expected to be the experts as 22-year-olds going out into the classroom. And they're still learning those communication skills. Like, have you found anything as you're out in schools that helps bridge that or helps develop that skill of communication, of negotiation, of between generations?
I think there are a couple of things. I have to tell you, one of the nicest interactions I ever had with a former student was with an undergrad who came back the year after he graduated. He found me And he said, you know, Dr. Friend, the best thing I had was that course on collaboration. And I have been an advocate of the coursework since I knew it was possible. He said, my first job interview, they started asking me questions about what I would do if, and they kept describing these tough situations. He was like, they didn't seem all that hard because I knew exactly what to say, because he had been immersed in exploring things like conflict and problem solving with other adults. And so I guess my first response is they really need to learn. That needs to be part of pre-service preparation. No one in the field of special ed walks out the door without facing a difficult interaction, probably in the first week of school. And so I think it is almost in higher ed, it's an abdication of our responsibility if students are not prepared. They will not be as good at it as they will as they get some maturity and get more experience, but they can still know how to address people, how to listen carefully, how to paraphrase, so that if it is a generational gap, they can focus on hearing what the other person is saying. Something else that I think has to be a part of that conversation is helping your students understand, please don't be offended, it's not about them. And I think sometimes that's kind of hard when young adults are just transitioning from their pre-service preparation into the field. It's like, no offense, kid is first, making sure that you are connecting with the families is second. And to accomplish that, certainly part of the pre-service prep, but then I am also a huge fan of formal or informal mentoring for early career professionals. You want a quick kind of good example? In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin CEC unit has a mentoring program going on where Wisconsin CEC members who are like brand new teachers get a partner with somebody who's more experienced, so that they have someone to bounce ideas off of and somebody to help them when they're facing those kinds of difficult interactions. It's not through the school district, it's the Wisconsin CEC unit. And so I think those kinds of things can also help a lot, so that people have a way to grow their skills, kind of, I want to say privately, you know, by just informally interacting with somebody. A few ideas for you.
If you don't mind me popping on, Dr. Welsh, there is a book by Andrew McPeak. He just recently did a professional development for the district I work for. And it's all about the different generations and the kind of hidden challenges through each of them. And communication is one of them. So in the chat, I'm actually going to put a link to the book that he recently gave to all of us at the PD. It's amazing. And so I think it would target a lot of what kind of you're asking.
That's a great suggestion. I have heard him speak and it's fascinating. Others?
Good. Well, that was one of the quickest hours I have spent this week, Dr. Friend. Amazing to hear you speak of difficult interactions. And I think it makes them easier to expect them, to know.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And so if we have used our time, and I see it is just about time to finish up, let me just quickly get us out of this. I want to wrap us up with a formal wrap up and send us on our way. Okay. First, how we interact in challenging situations will foster our collaboration or prevent it. Just keep that in mind. Everybody is stressed right now, and so I think we also have to have a lot of patience. You can read all the professional literature you want, but I like Ziggy. Some of us are more capable than most of us, but none of us is as capable as all of us. Seems like that could be a life rule that would help us all. And most importantly, I'd like to toast. I'd like to toast Elizabeth Farrell for all of her contributions to special education and our field in general. I'd like to toast CEC for its 100th anniversary and Illinois CEC for doing this wonderful series. I just love it. And of course, definitely a toast to all the professionals in schools who are holding it together, even though it's really hard to hold it together right now. And maybe, I don't know about you, but probably in less than 5 minutes, there will be a toast in my hand. So I'll admit that as well. I wish everybody all the best, and we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and we all have a lot to be thankful for this year, I'm sure. And I know everybody also has stressors. So I will say thank you very much. It's been great fun. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I wish everybody all the best.
Thank you so, so much. We greatly appreciate the time you shared with us, Dr. Friend.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow.
And Paula, thank you so much for all of your contact and patience and everything else.
My pleasure, dear. Thank you for being there.
All right.
And thank you for the wonderful part of our lives that you are.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.